Well, shifting gears from the conversation that I just had with Matt. Matt is joining as part of this larger panel, and I have a number of great folks who you have seen introed, who will be a part of this conversation. And recognizing that we have folks from retailers and brands in the organization or in the audience, we wanted to sort of widen that conversation around, some of the big shifts that we're seeing from consumer behaviors as a result of what's happened in the past 12 months or so, and then just looking ahead, what we can kind of expect from things changing and new business opportunities as a result. So let's go ahead and kick things off. I'm curious from, there's a lot of things that have happened and a lot's been talked about in terms of, digital acceleration, big consumer behavior shifts, et cetera. If you had to choose one that you find, one consumer behavior shift that you find extremely intriguing from a business opportunity point of view, I would love to sort of get a sense. And I know, Kofi, you had a thought, so maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Glad to be here, Scott. Yeah, one of the main things that I've been tracking, particularly in the past year with COVID and just kind of how things, the political climate, both within the US and abroad as well, is the effects of social distancing, specifically around driving consumer tribalism, or kind of these smaller groups of consumers who self-identify with specific worldviews. And I think what's different from now versus previously is that because we all rely on social media and we all curate our news and our worldview through social media, that's helped also shape that tribalism. So there was a report that said 61% of people, particularly in the US, last year during the political climate, unfriended or blocked someone who had an opposing point of view. So I think besides the environmental social distancing, which COVID has pushed us to, there's kind of this news and communication social distancing as well that is driving to this tribalism around, just gravitating towards those who are only really focused on your worldview. How I think that affects the business climate is that really brands are really going to have to find a balance between inclusivity and exclusivity. So how does your brand relate to a specific tribe and facilitate their worldview, but then also without ostracizing or excluding other worldviews? So that balance from a brand and business perspective is one that's really rich for brands that are really purpose-driven and really understand kind of what the brand values are and can really communicate that widely to a specific tribe.
That's really fascinating. I mean, we had seen this kind of shift towards these hyper niche kind of communities, and I've never necessarily heard it expressed in the way that you kind of talk about it, which is, to your point, it's super delicate balance to be inclusive, but then recognize that each of these kind of groups has a very specific sort of point of view that they're approaching things. And Lauren, I wonder if you can sort of jump in a little bit and share anything that you think, from a consumer shift that you're really tracking at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So I think the larger shift in media consumption is super intriguing. We've seen pre-pandemic the decline in traditional outlets like TV and terrestrial radio, but then of course in 2020 and certainly already in 2021, we're seeing those increases persist, or decreases, I should say, persist, and increases in digital. So we see tons of digital players and platforms rising. So that's anything from streaming video to audio to social. You just see more consumers that are leaning into those platforms. And what's interesting is that just disrupts, I think, a lot, especially where retailers used to play, right? If you think about TV advertising and production and all of that, you just see people shifting into more of the streaming platforms. And I think that adds a layer of complexity, right? So a lot of these platforms, if you think about even the Netflix of the world, right? They're subscription based. And so oftentimes while people are engaging more with them, it's harder for advertisers to actually address them because people are basically buying to not see advertising, right? So I think the complexity of that, of going where consumers are, but finding the nuance within that and making sure that they're addressing people where they're at and engaging them. And I think digital also offers an opportunity to get closer to conversion. So you have upper funnel opportunities to brand, but then it actually gives you a platform to transition into a sale more readily as well. So you see a lot of shoppable videos, shoppable audio, and just a nice play into that interaction to get people closer to a sale. So I think it's going to be something that people lean into more, and brands have to make sure that they're resonating there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, specifically with some of the big players that you mentioned, where you're paying to be a subscriber and what that ultimately means, and how they're trying to think about monetizing that and creating content that people actually want to participate in from a brand-led perspective. And then to your point, bringing in some of that that close-in content plus commerce, or content plus whatever as a part of that is really huge. I'm curious, from anyone's perspective, what are your thoughts around the whole sort of shift towards live streaming as a sort of viable way to sell product and kind of bring consumers into that sort of live shopping experience?
I think it's hard to do well. I think, we see things like Clubhouse right now, and it's very, to me, reminiscent of when Instagram Live first started, where at first everybody goes live, everybody wants to kind of create their own shows. But then what we quickly realize is it's hard to do that. It's hard to create content live and keep people's attention, unless you're like, if Beyonce just turns on the camera, it'll be awesome, right? Because everyone wants to see what she's doing, but not everyone's Beyonce, right? Most people actually have to entertain people, and they're not good at doing that. So I think it's the select few will do a great job at it, right? Like just like QVC did with television, and so many other companies fail, and most will fail. And I think you just have to figure out, is that a place that you can play effectively in?
Yeah, it's interesting. I find that I hadn't considered it from that point of view. I think, to your point, with something like Clubhouse, because it's so new, maybe consumers are more forgiving early on, but that probably falls off pretty quickly.
Right now, it's about the medium more than the message. To get used to the medium, and then you need substance in the message, and that's when the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And the same happened with Instagram Live.
Yeah, and I imagine too, with a lot of this, it's probably more realistic to consider that very specific instances will be appropriate for most brands when they're thinking about live streaming a brand new product, or something very curated and blown out, whatever the case might be. So awesome. So thinking about we're in the context of a retail conference right now, and the physical store environment has shifted, and people's kind of threshold for what they're expecting as a part of that has changed, whether that's, again, retail, eating in restaurants, attending sporting events, live concerts, etc. What do we sort of see as the new expectations for customers relative to their comfort levels interacting in physical spaces moving forward? And then I guess as a follow-up, what's the expectation for how the store or that physical environment needs to change as a result of that?
May I?
Yeah, Amanda, why don't you dive in there, please?
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for having me. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, Bain Co ran a global study. We interviewed consumers from various countries across the globe, and the one fundamental learning, which is astonishing, is we are such a homogenous global population. We were holding our breaths for huge differences. We really didn't see those differences per geography. But what we did see was you could almost draw a line down the world's population. 50% fell into what we were calling the great reluctance. So the consumers are really, really nervous about life during the pandemic and post the pandemic. On the flip side of the line were who we conveniently labeled the great escapists, who were literally from day one planning their way out, not breaking the law by any means, but looking to how they could hack the circumstances, or in the best case scenario, what they could book, 3 years in advance, just having something to look forward to. And so I'm fascinated at watching both groups emerge out of this. But also another fundamental learning that we had was that if you can flip your minds back to April, when the world was scurrying for toilet roll and pasta, okay, we were scurrying around for what is essential. So if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it was like, what do I need to survive? Well, what an amazing bunch we are. We need toilet paper and pasta, job done. We need nothing else. But what's really interesting is that as consumers, we have been redefining what essential means as we go through Maslow's hierarchy of needs almost. So to flip back to your question, what does this mean in retail? Of course, we're going to see the need for hygiene and hygiene theatre. Now, there's the hygiene for the great reluctance, and there's the hygiene theatre for the great escapists. They can kind of go, I did it, I survived it, and you must too. There's going to be this, through this time, I believe, and the data that we saw is this evolution of what essential means. I've gone from survival to working out what I need for my happiness. And that is something that I'm going to look to, and consumers are definitely going to look to in the retail environment. So the basics of the hygiene theatre, all the way to make me smile, give me fantasy, give me what I've been deprived of for the last year.
Yeah, that's an amazing way of kind of thinking about things. And it was interesting because early on, the consumer had sort of already gotten to that place, but then businesses needed to kind of catch up. And now we're sort of at the point where, I remember going into stores and, literally holding my breath and trying to run through and get through as quickly as possible. And now that, things are feel a little bit more normalized, I suppose. So to get to that aspirational point now that we're in the midst of the long haul is really interesting, not only from a physical point of view, but just from a brand or retailer sort of like tapping into the consumer need state, I suppose. Does anyone want to pick up on any of those ideas that Amanda just touched on?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see also, based on what Amanda is talking about, what I'm seeing also is that compared to other times in the past when this has happened more recently with technology and such, I think that part of that shift also, and seeing that evolution of those two groups, is really around, how does technology facilitate, but then also stay out of the way, because I'm seeing a lot more need for a human connection, both in the curation of ideas, the just connection in general, because we've all been kind of stuck inside. So, who are the people that I trust are in my circle, however big that circle is, and how are they also curating and facilitating a lot of what Amanda's talking about, which is what I'm trying to escape or I'm trying to retract. So from a brand perspective, it's less about algorithms and kind of, automation. And even though that makes sense from a operations perspective, but how do you translate that into a human connection, a human curation? We're seeing some of that in Netflix. I know Pandora is doing some of that from like curating lists. And then also Amazon just signed a deal with Donald Glover, the actor, to curate content as well. So we know Amazon has a ton of algorithms, and they don't, we've already been fed we already feel the algorithm and getting some recommendations back. But now putting that human layer between the algorithm and the community might be a different trend that we might see coming forth.
Yeah, that sort of human piece, I think, is really interesting, and for all the reasons that you mentioned, Kofi, particularly the fact that we're seeing things like loneliness become this sort of like ongoing epidemic and almost this like kind of post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of all of this. And so needing companies to sort of have that human and empathetic kind of point of view is so hugely important kind of moving forward, like outside of, you know, trying to sell to a consumer or meet their needs. It's just like this, you know, bigger kind of thing that's required. Matt, I wonder if you have thoughts just from thinking about, you know, the brand loyalty kind of point of view. I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but how you see that sort of, you know, in light of some of the comments, and how you see that sort of shaping going forward what brands or retailers need to be thinking about to sort of capture consumers.
So I think generally speaking, brand loyalty is really a function of attention and mind share. I think when the brands that you think about most are the ones that you're generally loyal to. You know, and as a result, I think the lower involvement categories have a bigger challenge at brand loyalty because you're just not thinking about them a lot. So during the pandemic, if, you know, a common product was out at the grocery store or an Instacart, you would just replace it and it didn't really matter. That wouldn't be the same thing with your phone, right? If you wanted to get the new iPhone and they were out, you wouldn't just switch to a Samsung phone, right? So that's the example of brand loyalty kind of brought to its most common point. I think that as a result of that, many companies are now looking to diversify their consumer touch points. So you have Tide looking to get into, laundromats, so consumers could touch and feel their product. You have Lululemon buying Mirror, which is a in-home connected fitness device. So you're interacting with their brand much more and you're connecting first-party data. I think you're going to start to see more and more of this, where you're going to have companies not just innovate through content and social media. And because for a while, the way that a lot of companies are trying to solve for that is they would come out with their own, content show. Everyone wanted to be the next Red Bull. And I think everyone realizes that nobody wants to watch, a content show from a company that makes, dishwashing soap, right? But if I made dishwashing soap, I may want to buy a company that makes a connected dishwasher and basically sell that at a subsidized rate. So I'm touching the consumer more often and it only takes my dishwashing soap. And now all of a sudden, I have way more touch points. I have first party data and I have that loyalty. So I think building an ecosystem, increasing the touch points, connecting first party data is what a lot of these companies are going to need to do to continue to thrive and build, their share of customer.
And Lauren, I wonder if you, have thoughts relative to, this whole sort of brand loyalty piece and what that's sort of evolving into from your perspective.
Yeah, Matt, those are amazing points and super interesting thinking about the ecosystem piece of it. Yeah. Back to the last question, I think humanity, right? So a part of building loyalty is about the humanity and understanding people's why, right? And so brands want to know, certainly like what's the why that gets people ticking and have that aligned to their brand values and speak to that more readily too. And consumers are being more discerning, right? They're voting with their dollars, particularly as we are coming out of an election season, right? That's readily important when it comes to social, economical issues and things of the like. And so people are investing in places where they not only see a value, right, from does this meet my convenience need? Does this actually bring me what I want on that end of the spectrum? But also, does it hit on my values and the things that I believe in and the things that are important to me? And so I think it's really important that brands are thinking about their larger message and what they stand for, and they're not negotiating on that, right? There's so many things that are happening in the news where brands are expected to respond quickly, and so having that internal value system and that North Star and being clear and transparent and speaking to it, I think that also creates a lot of loyalty. Or in the instances where brands mess up, a lot of brand switching, right? Or cancel culture also. So it's just super interesting to think about how loyalty hits on the heartstrings and what people care about, particularly when brands, I think, become a bigger social consumer in the world and their statements really matter about what's the health of the world and the things that are being requested of essentially from global citizens. I think brands that do this really well, Patagonia always stands out to me. I think what they do for protecting endangered lands is really impressive and powerful. And then Target too, my alma mater, I just continuing as a Black consumer, continue to be impressed with what they're doing in terms of not just what are they stocking on their shelves, how are they communicating to me and what means the most to me as a Black consumer? And then also like the internal ecosystem too. How do they treat team members, and what are the things that they're standing for in times of disruption? So I think that really speaks to how people are choosing to shop as well.
That's amazing. I think it's really interesting, particularly on that last point, how we saw consumers being mindful of the sort of internal culture existing within the companies that they chose to support or not support based on, a lot specifically around sort of like treatment of essential workers and, their role within communities, et cetera. So I think it's, really fascinating to see that kind of like idea of purpose and how that's evolving and finally kind of like the reality of what consumers say they believe in and how they spend kind of meeting together. Amanda, I don't know if you have thoughts relative to that in terms of, sort of purpose within the context of the broader kind of brand, or, relating also, even beyond that to some of the things you touched on before, the kind of like hierarchy of needs and some of this more aspirational kind of ideas that brands can create within consumers' lives.
Well, unsurprisingly, I have 1,000 opinions about almost everything everybody has said. And Lauren, I'm big on the nods around when you're talking about the why. And with somebody with my surname, I go from the why to the how. And I also just, no pun intended, actually, Scott, I'm also going to jump to something that you said. I'm a huge, I absolutely love human beings. However, I don't believe a lot of what they say, which is why I spend a lot of time trying to convince the clients that I have the pleasure of working with to prove out that say-do gap. So the astonishing figure that quite rightly 60% of consumers say that they want to make far more ethical decisions around their purchasing habits, but in fact only 32%, I think the last data I saw, were prepared to pay for it. So we have to listen to that why, Lauren, but brands mustn't shout too soon. They've got to prove out that say-do gap before they get on those platforms and talk about it, to really establish what it is, the role that they can play in that more positive action, but to be sure that they're taking their consumers with them. Otherwise, it's quite bile-inducing. It's very, very, very uncomfortable. So it's all from the corner that I stand in, it's constantly about producing the evidence that people will do what they say they're going to do, and that they're going to meet that contract with you, and they're going to help build that better world, but be part of paying for it. And I don't mean that in a mercenary way. And I think that the brands that are staying close to their consumers, constantly have that tap on, are the brands that are winning. It's the ones that you work with that say, no, we've got some data, it's about a year old now. And you're like, then it's a year old. Look what happened. Look what's happened in a year. And that's aside from the pandemic. There's no excuse for turning on or off those budgets anymore. There's also, to my mind, no excuse for the extensive roadmap. The North Star that Lauren talked about, we all need one. We absolutely need one, but we need those small steps to get there, to test and learn and to pivot along the way, to know exactly what it is that we're aiming for, but not have that outdated and extortionately expensive roadmap to get there, because anything can be thrown down at us at any point. It's having that agility to be holding hands with your consumers the whole way, but to pivot with them whichever way they want to go.
I love that. I think that speaks to values in a lot of ways too, right? When you know what you stand behind, then you can make decisions on the fly that change is going to happen around you. But if you're like, hey, this is the North Star, you know whether you're saying yes or no to something, you know whether you're acting upon something or you're sitting on the sidelines. So I think readily it is about how do you align on that and then ultimately make decisions based on that playbook, ultimately knowing that so many things are going to change along the way, but you at least have some sort of system in place, the right people in a room to make a decision, aligned of course to the customer values, but also to your company values as well.
And I would just like to add that, oh, sorry, just one last thing. What I've seen also is that with that, as Amanda mentioned, holding the hand with the consumer and saying, okay, this is the North Star, this is what we aspire to. But as folks who are have the same purpose or the same vision or whatever as the brand and its consumer, there's a lot more flexibility if the brand gets it wrong as well, right? So the consumer is more likely, cancel culture is a real thing, but I think the brands that are able to come out of those errors are the ones who both admit it and have a close connection to their tribes, and so those tribes end up forgiving the brands, and they give the brand a little bit more of a leeway to make mistakes because we all are essentially human.
Yep. Well put.
Yeah, it's you all are. I appreciate this, like this idea of resilience, which is all a part of the bigger conversation that we're having today. I think it's, all of the things that you all are talking about here, and having that guiding star, but then being able to sort of pivot and sort of shift based on what's actually happening, and know that perfection is a great goal, but the reality of it is probably much more of this kind of test and learn and experiment, etc. So one of the big things that we saw happening within the context of consumer behaviors more broadly was this digital acceleration, as everyone sort of talks about it. And there's been so many new platforms that have arisen over the past 12 months. Obviously, TikTok is now the big thing that everybody's talking about, but it's also being discussed alongside all of these other platforms. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, if there's a particular sort of digital channel or platform that you're really excited about right now as a way of kind of tapping into the consumer in today's world. Maybe Matt, do you have an opinion on that?
On what types of brands?
Digital channel that you see as being like really exciting right now for tapping into consumer.
I mean, I think that channels are almost table stakes right now. I think it's much more important. I mean, reaching consumers in a very targeted way, especially over mobile devices, used to be in itself the idea, right? The medium was kind of the idea. Now it's really all about how you activate. I think regardless of what platform you're on, you need to understand what right do you have to play in a category that nobody else can, or no one can do as good as you, and how can you deliver upon that in the way that meets the consumer's needs? Whether you're buying a TV spot and entertaining consumers, whether you're building your own fitness platform, or whether you're have a customer service engine which allows consumers to really feel a point of connection. There's many different ways that you can do it, but ultimately you need to deliver value to the consumer and think about the consumer first and selling your product next, regardless of what the channel is.
Right. And so just because they're there and they exist doesn't mean that you need to be necessarily touching all of them.
Yeah, a channel's not an idea anymore. It was for a while. I don't think it is anymore.
Lauren, I know you're in the business of audio, and that's something that's a particular interest to you. Maybe you can talk about some of that, what's exciting you within the audio space right now.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, audio is an emerging platform. It's increasing in usage as I was speaking to the consumer consumption behavior and those shifts. I think, work from home and arguably life from home has just created such a disruption in how people are using audio. And I just think that at this point in time, our eyes are taxed, right? Like, how many people are tired of Zoom calls and all these online interactions, right? Whereas our ears have bandwidth, and listening in and leaning into music, into podcasting, into platforms, even like a Clubhouse. I think it's just super fascinating how audio is just interacting with people in a new way. I think it's a soundtrack to people's days, right? You can have music on in the background. Ultimately, when you're working, it takes you through different phases throughout your day. So if you're thinking about, I wake up to music, I work out to a playlist or a podcast, I'm meditating to a certain soundtrack. It just is an opportunity to kind of lean into somebody's everyday existence. And when you're thinking about it with a retailer hat on, right, it's these moments that are endemic to somebody's livelihood, right? So you're maybe listening to something when you're cooking dinner and you're like, oh, I'm out of something, or I hear an ad for something that's super connected to what you're doing in that moment, laundry detergent while you're doing your laundry or whatnot. So I think it's an opportunity to meet people where they're at as listening is happening more, as well as just, meet people in this immersive environment, particularly as voice comes into play, right? Like voice commerce is super fascinating to me, particularly because we're talking to our devices more when we are on the move or now when we're at home. So I just think that it's a platform that I get super excited about. That's why I came to the company I'm at right now, is I just really get geeky about the opportunity to meet consumers in this moment in time where audio is truly a platform that's super immersive. Plus, I think there's an interesting play on the fact that it's a low production, lift essentially, right? So when you speak to being nimble, needing to make movement based on consumer behaviors, it's an opportunity to write a script and cast a character to then lean into that, right? Whereas you don't need a set to build out a commercial or things of that nature. So it's just much more nimble and an opportunity for brands to really win.
Yeah, it's fascinating. From a very personal point of view, not having my commute anymore, I really miss the time that I don't have to listen to podcasts so much. It's like a big not dark spot, but it's like a gap in my life right now. I do think that audio as a medium is very interesting, and there's a lot of cool experiments that are happening there right now as well. So.
Yeah, just to add on to a note that Amanda, you said, right? It's the power of it in the sense of like, it's personal, right? So one person can hear one thing and paint a picture of it in their mind that looks different than somebody else's. So if you hear kids laughing, right, you're going to picture your kids most likely, or your nieces and nephews or whatnot. If you hear, maybe the backdrop to a shower or something, you're thinking about the routine you have in the morning, right? So it doesn't give you a prescriptive way to look at something like visual representation of something does. Instead, it gets into the theater of the mind, and it gives people an opportunity to really say, what does that mean to me? How does it look and feel to me and in my life? And I think when you're talking about inclusion, Kofi, you mentioned this, that's a really good way to get inclusive, is just, let somebody develop in their minds what that actually looks like to them. And so I think that's a really powerful opportunity too for the landscape within audio.
Interesting.
It'll be interesting to see as we look at that trend, and we're talking about it, like how that translates as we come out of COVID, the middle of COVID, and people start going into retail spaces, how that then translates into how the curation of the environment and the ambiance that the retail spaces how they build that in, because people are going to want to go into stores, but then we're used to these rituals of walking, or as Lauren, as you mentioned, or someone mentioned, you're cooking and you're listening to something, and that both triggers you, but it also inspires you. So how does that, now that you have the ability to go into a store or retail environment, how can you take that with you? Is it still more personal, as in the sense that I have my headphones on, or is there some kind of a broader experience? So that's one place for retailers to explore. Be interesting to see that.
I think it's both, right? Like somebody can choose to have their individual experience and have their earbuds in their ears, but then you can have overhead music, right? That sets the tone for a shopping experience, whether it's by a particular store or category in store, you can have those cues. So I think that music and shopping and pairing the right mood and mindset with that, you see dividends in sales, you see opportunities for lifts and things like that, because music can inspire consumer behavior, right? I think during the holiday season, most retailers do it poorly. So I feel like, sometimes music in stores has a bad rap because you're just used to hearing that same holiday playlist over and over again. But when you do it right, it's personal to your brand ethos. it's an opportunity to really get people into that immersive experience and heighten all different sounds, right? Like I love hotels. You walk in, you smell, you hear, it just puts you in this relaxed state more often than not. And so I think there's power in activating more of your senses in retail experiences.
I think the bar is going to be higher than ever for retailers because consumers are going to be shifting from a comfort state where they are now, where they're, wearing sweats and they have record high savings. Those of us who've been lucky enough to keep a job, people are they have more time than we've ever had before. And when we can shift back towards an excitement, adventure state, people are going to go out and do things, right? They're going to want to go to restaurants. They're going to want to travel and do these things. And time is going to become more valuable again than it is now when people have all day to just sit around because they can't go anywhere. And when time is more valuable, people are going to be more discerning about how they spend it. So if someone's going to go into your store versus just purchasing that product on Amazon, they're going to expect more than just a product or service that you sell. So companies are going to have to entertain, inspire, teach, connect, a variety of different things wherever they can do best to make it worthwhile for consumers to step in there.
We've been talking about retail and retailtainment and the concept of it for some years, and I was thinking, and Matt, what you're saying was reminding me that, when we used to wax lyrical about the marvels of the internet, we used to say that, look, there was a website called Burnt Marshmallows, which was this meeting place for people that love camping, right? And you could, whatever kind of pot you were, you could find your lid online. And what's really interesting is I can almost see the model flipping now, and that actually retail spaces will become the arenas to connect those people in the physical world, because we want to meet these people now. Yep. We want to have a safe place to come together, because in this year we've been building sub communities and sub communities and been able to kind of build up all these different lives. So for me, the kind of the retail space as an online community space come real is going to be really interesting to watch.
Totally agree on that one. Like, it's interesting to see how brands have pivoted, right? Because the immersive store experience was something that was a lean in for a lot of brands, right? Or they built their whole ecosystem against it. Like Camp, you all at PSFK had the Camp founder Ben on, and I think it's fascinating how his model of business was completely disrupted, but they pivoted successfully into an online experience. They're building a new suite of consumers that are shopping with them, and then they get to fold that expertise and that insight back into a store environment when people feel safe enough to go back there too. So I think the in-store experience, if I'm betting big on anything, that's where I'm leaning in. 15% of sales are attached to e-com, and that's still such a small number, right? Yes, it grew, threefold to years prior, but there's still a big part of sales that are attached to a in-store experience. And so I think people are going to be integrating a lot of the learnings during the pandemic into the digital integrations, into the community integrations into the store, and then creating something new emerging out of this, right? So whether it's experiential activations, whether it's the music integration, if it's things that are just creating more ease, like Amazon drop-offs built into a store experience that isn't Amazon, right? You're getting people more connection points back to your why, back to the things you stand for, back to the experience that's important to their humanity, right? So connecting all the dots of the things that we talked about before and giving them ample reasons to engage with you. And I think people are eager for that. They're anxious, right? If you live alone, you're by yourself, don't have family, you want that connection point. And I think these immersive experiences and experiential activations, particularly with retail, are super important.
Yeah, that notion of retail therapy really is extremely important now, and what that actually means. And I love that idea of community that's being discussed as, again, I think of that as a part of an ecosystem kind of play as well. Especially, early on, we saw the brands that had strong built-in communities recognizing how, forgive the noise in the background, that had the built-in communities, knowing how to tap into that, recognizing the needs that they could sort of fulfill, and then thinking about how that comes to life offline again is really interesting.
I would also just like to add that I sincerely hope that retailers find their heart in the way that many brands have. And you know, there's no doubt the victims on the high street, you know, it's unparalleled, the mourning, the death of the high street. And for the small independent store owners, you know, how are they surviving? And I really, really hope that the big retailers set up like conscious programs where they are bringing in those artists, those creators, those makers, and giving them space, and being the landlords that the commercial property developers have failed to be. I should be really looking to them to be exploring that and not exploiting that.
I like that idea, Amanda, because essentially, so the big retailers are usually not embedded in whatever community they are. And I think that's an advantage for the smaller retailers, where they understand the community, the local community on an intimate level, such that partnering up with a larger brand that has the distribution, that has kind of the the support system to facilitate revenue and product range, both marrying that with the intimate nature that the local retailers have, will be interesting to see, because you know, you do really get kind of that localized curation, you know, from a human neighborhood perspective, but then the access to the goods and the products and the resources that the big brands are able to bring. So every big brand doesn't have to go in and rent their own space and kind of embed their whole thing and try and figure out the community from the ground up. There are already people there doing that, similar to community resources that you could just tap into and partner up with to accelerate and amplify the partnership.
I think it's interesting, you know, it doesn't also always have to be about bringing the products of a local retailer into the marketplace. It could be, you know, what are you doing for the local community in terms of CSR? And how are you integrating maybe artists into the design of your store, or the art that's within your store? Or, you know, how are you bringing incubator programming into, you know, a certain community or things of that nature? So I think it, you know, one for one, it is tough to say like all of our, you know, vendors, we're going to have X amount of representation. I think some brands are doing that, right? If you think about even just Black vendors, right? And the brands that are making statements about 15% of their offering is going to be from Black curators, as an example. But I do think it's looking at all the different ways that bigger retailers can have an impact on a local community, being very thoughtful stewards of their community, right? And I think that's going to look different. And that goes back to what's your value system, what's authentic to you, because if you're doing something just to do something, people are going to sniff that out too. So it goes back to, Amanda, what you were saying, where it's like, actually figure out, co-collaborate with your consumers, do some test and measuring, and identify what are the things that are going to resonate with them from a local market perspective.
Yeah, I love it. It's interesting, full circle, going back to Kofi's initial comment about the sort of tribalism that's happened. And I feel like local is perhaps one of the few things that people in a specific community can kind of agree upon. So to sort of have that as something that you can attach yourself to and, you know, help foster in many ways, I think is,
and it's very hard to scale. It's hard to scale local.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that's a nice way to kind of end off the conversation. I know we could continue kind of talking about so many different things, but we do have time. So I appreciate Kofi, Lauren, Amanda, and Matt, all of your great insights, sharing that with the audience. And good luck to everyone. Stay well in 2021, and hope to have an opportunity to chat with you all soon.
Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.